The 4th of June, 1942 dawned with deceptive calm over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Yet beneath that tranquility churned the most consequential naval confrontation of the 20th century. 6 months had passed since Japanese aircraft had transformed Pearl Harbor into an inferno of twisted steel and shattered dreams, and America's Pacific Fleet still bore the scars of that December morning. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, studying intelligence reports that would determine whether the United States Navy could survive as a fighting force or whether the Empire of Japan would complete its domination of the Pacific theater. The Japanese strategy following Pearl Harbor had been devastatingly effective. Their forces had swept through Southeast Asia like a tsunami, claiming the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with shocking speed. General Douglas MacArthur had fled the Philippines with his famous promise to return, while thousands of American and Filipino soldiers faced the horror of the Bataan Death March. British colonial power crumbled before the Japanese onslaught, and Australia itself seemed within reach of imperial ambitions. The rising sun flag flew over an empire stretching from the frozen Aleutian Islands to the tropical shores of New Guinea, encompassing territories that held nearly 400 million people and resources that could fuel a war machine for decades. Yet Nimitz possessed something his adversary did not expect: broken Japanese codes and the brilliant minds who could decipher them. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts at Station Hypo worked in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, operating on little sleep and endless cups of coffee as they pieced together fragments of intercepted Japanese communications. Their work revealed that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet, was planning something audacious. References to AF appeared repeatedly in decoded messages, and Rochefort became convinced this mysterious designation referred to Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway held strategic importance far beyond its size. The atoll consisted of 2 small islands surrounded by a coral reef, but its location made it an unsinkable aircraft carrier guarding the approaches to Hawaii. If Japan captured Midway, they could threaten the Hawaiian Islands themselves and force the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a final, decisive battle on Japanese terms. Yamamoto planned to use Midway as bait, luring American carriers into a trap where his superior forces would annihilate them, completing the work begun at Pearl Harbor. To confirm that AF indeed meant Midway, Rochefort devised an ingenious deception. He instructed Midway's garrison to send an uncoded message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese communications mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The trap was confirmed, and now Nimitz knew exactly where and when Yamamoto would strike. This intelligence breakthrough, derived from efforts documented extensively in military histories and accounts, such as those published in Naval History magazine, gave America its first genuine advantage in the Pacific War. Nimitz faced a daunting challenge. His entire available carrier force consisted of 3 flat tops: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The latter had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May and required months of repairs. Yet Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers performed miracles, patching her hull and flight deck in just 72 hours. Against these 3 carriers, Yamamoto would bring 4 of Japan's finest: Akagi Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, veterans of Pearl Harbor and numerous victories since. The Japanese carriers fielded more aircraft, more experienced pilots, and better torpedoes than their American counterparts. The odds appeared suicidal, but Nimitz understood that wars were won not by those with the best odds, but by those who seized fleeting opportunities with absolute commitment. He gave command of the carrier task forces to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise. Spruance, a cruiser commander by training, had received this assignment only because Admiral William Halsey lay hospitalized with a severe skin condition. This twist of fate would prove momentous, as Spruance possessed a calculating intelligence and ice-cold composure perfectly suited for the coming battle. As American carriers steamed toward their rendezvous northeast of Midway, the men aboard knew they sailed toward a battle that would determine their nation's fate in the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever constructed, and contemplated the intricate plan he had crafted to deliver a knockout blow to American naval power. Born in 1884 in the village of Nagaoka, Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington, giving him insights into American industrial might that most of his colleagues lacked. Ironically, he had opposed war with the United States, warning Japan's leaders that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that he had no expectation of success. Those 6 months were nearly exhausted, and Yamamoto knew he must force a decisive engagement before American shipyards could replace their losses and overwhelm Japan with sheer production capacity. The Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April had shocked the Japanese high command and embarrassed the military leadership that had promised the emperor his homeland would never face attack. Colonel James Doolittle's 16-beat 105 bombers had caused minimal physical damage when they struck Tokyo on the 18th of April, but the psychological impact reverberated through every level of Japanese society. The attack proved that Japan's defensive perimeter remained vulnerable, and that America retained both the will and capability to strike back. Yamamoto convinced Imperial General Headquarters that capturing Midway would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. The operation would extend Japan's defensive perimeter, eliminate Midway as a base for American submarines and patrol aircraft. Most importantly, draw out the American carriers for annihilation. The admiral divided his forces into multiple groups: a diversionary strike against the Aleutian Islands to split American attention, a powerful carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo to soften Midway's defenses, an invasion fleet to capture the atoll, and his own main body built around Yamato and its sister ship to deliver the final blow once American carriers appeared. Vice Admiral Nagumo commanded the Kido Butte, Japan's elite carrier striking force that had dominated every engagement since Pearl Harbor. His flagship Akagi, meaning Red Castle, displaced over 40,000 tons and could launch over 70 aircraft. Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu formed the rest of his devastating punch. These vessels carried the finest naval aviators in the world, men who had trained relentlessly for years and participated in Japan's campaigns in China and now the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukita, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, would coordinate the airstrikes despite recovering from appendicitis. The Japanese plan's complexity bordered on hubris. Forces were scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, making mutual support impossible. The diversionary attack on the Aleutians stripped away to carriers that might have tipped the balance at Midway. Yamamoto's main body sailed hundreds of miles behind Nagumo's carriers, too distant to intervene if things went wrong. Most critically, Japanese intelligence had failed catastrophically, convinced that Yorktown had been sunk at Coral Sea and that the Americans could field at most to carriers at Midway. The Japanese military culture contributed to these failures. Junior officers dared not contradict their superiors, and reconnaissance efforts proved inadequate. Search planes from the Japanese cruiser Tone launched late due to catapult problems, creating a gap in coverage at precisely the wrong moment. The Kido Butte's battle-tested crews had grown perhaps too confident after 6 months of unbroken victories. They expected another triumph, another step toward forcing America to negotiate a peace that would leave Japan's conquered territories intact. As the 1st of June arrived, Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers steamed eastward through fog and rain, maintaining radio silence to preserve surprise. Aboard Akagi, pilots gathered for briefings on Midway's defenses. The runway, hangars, fuel tanks, and command facilities they would reduce to rubble. The aviators joked and smoked, confident in their abilities and their cause. They had struck Pearl Harbor, Ceylon, Darwin, and a dozen other targets without serious loss. Midway would be another name added to their list of conquests. What these men did not know was that their encrypted communications had been read, their target identified, and 3 American carriers already waited northeast of Midway in an ambush position. The hunters were about to become the hunted, though neither side yet realized how completely the next few days would transform the Pacific. War. The sun rose on the 2nd of June with Japanese forces arrayed in their complex formation, each element proceeding toward its designated objective, according to Yamamoto's carefully crafted plan. Meanwhile, far to the east, American sailors conducted final preparations for battle. Ordnancemen loaded torpedoes and bombs onto elevators that would carry them to the hangar decks. Mechanics performed last checks on aircraft engines. Pilots studied recognition silhouettes of Japanese ships and aircraft, knowing that confusion in combat could prove fatal. The fleet maintained strict radio silence, hoping to preserve their single greatest advantage: surprise, born of broken codes and brilliant intelligence work. Colonel Harold Shannon commanded the garrison on Midway Atoll, and he understood perfectly well that his small force stood directly in the path of an overwhelming Japanese assault. The atoll consisted of two tiny islands, eastern and sand, encompassing barely 6 square miles of land surrounded by a coral reef in the middle of the vast Pacific. Yet this insignificant speck of coral and sand had been transformed into a fortress bristling with coastal defense guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and fighters that would contest every inch of airspace above the reef. Shannon's Marines numbered fewer than 3,000 men, supported by Navy personnel operating radar stations, seaplanes, and the crucial runway on Eastern Island. The island's air contingent included Marine Fighter Squadron 221, flying obsolete Brewster, Buffalo fighters that veteran pilots called flying coffins, along with more capable Grumman Wildcats, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and long-range PBY Catalina patrol aircraft crowded every available space on the cramped airstrips. These men knew they faced the same carrier force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, and they prepared accordingly. Intelligence reports delivered by submarine allowed Shannon to anticipate the attack's timing. On the 3rd of June, APBY, piloted by Ensign Jack Reed, spotted Japanese transport ships 570 miles west-southwest of Midway. Reed's radio crackled with excitement as he reported 9 enemy vessels proceeding toward the atoll. This was Midway's invasion force, the troops who would occupy the atoll once Nagumo's carriers had obliterated its defenses. 4 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers immediately launched from Midway to attack these transports, though their high-altitude bombing runs achieved no hits against the maneuvering ships. The garrison spent the night of the 3rd preparing for the dawn assault everyone knew was coming. Marines checked ammunition supplies and field guns. Anti-aircraft crews tested their mechanisms for the 100th time. Pilots grabbed what sleep they could, knowing dawn would bring the fight of their lives. The radar operators on Sand Island maintained constant vigilance, their primitive but functional equipment capable of detecting aircraft at over 100 miles distance. At 4:30 on the morning of the 4th of June, a PBY Catalina piloted by Lieutenant Howard 80 radioed the message that sealed Midway's fate and triggered the greatest carrier battle in history. Many planes heading Midway bearing 320, distance 150. Minutes later came the confirmation everyone dreaded. Enemy carriers, Nagumo strike force of 108 aircraft, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, bore down on the tiny atoll with orders to destroy its ability to launch aircraft and defend itself. Shannon ordered every flyable aircraft into the air. Fighters scrambled to intercept the incoming strike while bombers and torpedo planes fled eastward toward the reported position of the Japanese carriers. The obsolete Buffaloes and outnumbered Wildcats climbed desperately to meet the incoming Japanese strike force, which consisted of 36 Nakajima Cape bombers, 36 Aichi Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. The Americans faced impossible odds, but they would sell their lives dearly. The air battle over Midway erupted with savage intensity as Marine fighters tore into the Japanese formations. Captain John Carey led his Buffalo fighters against the escorting Zeros in a hopeless mismatch. The Mitsubishi Zeros, designed by the brilliant engineer Jiro Horikoshi, outclassed the American fighters in speed, maneuverability, and climb rate. Within minutes, Japanese pilots had shot down 15 of the 26 Marine fighters that engaged them. Captain Kirk Armistead died when his Buffalo exploded under Zero cannon fire. Second Lieutenant Charles Coons's aircraft disintegrated around him, though he somehow survived to parachute into the lagoon. Those Marines who died buying precious minutes for their comrades on the ground would never know how crucial their sacrifice proved. The Japanese strike force, disrupted by the American fighters and facing intense anti-aircraft fire, scattered their bombing runs across Midway's installations. Bombs cratered the runway on Eastern Island and destroyed several buildings, igniting fuel tanks that sent columns of black smoke thousands of feet into the air. The powerhouse on Sand Island took direct hits, knocking out electrical power. Marine defenders manning anti-aircraft guns maintained continuous fire despite bombs exploding around them. Lieutenant Tominaga surveyed the damage from his bomber and concluded that a second strike would be necessary to fully suppress Midway's defenses. He radioed Nagumo. "There is need for a second attack." This message, transmitted at 7 o'clock that morning, would prove one of the most consequential communications of the entire battle. Nagumo faced a terrible dilemma. He had held back 93 aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in reserve to attack any American carriers that appeared. If he rearmed these aircraft with fragmentation bombs for a second strike on Midway, he would leave his fleet vulnerable should American flat tops suddenly appear. Back on Midway, Shannon's Marines surveyed the damage and counted their losses. The defenders had shot down several Japanese aircraft, but the atoll's facilities had suffered severe damage. Medical personnel treated dozens of wounded men, while damage control parties battled fires and cleared debris from the runway. Despite the devastation, the garrison's spirit remained unbroken. Radio operators continued tracking Japanese positions, and mechanics worked frantically to repair damaged aircraft. The American carriers were out there somewhere, and Midway's job was to survive long enough for them to strike. Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance stood on the flag bridge of USS Enterprise, processing information flooding in from multiple sources and calculating odds with the precision of the mathematics professor he might have become in another life. Born in 1886 in Baltimore, Spruance had compiled a reputation throughout the Navy as an officer of exceptional intellect and unshakable composure. Unlike many of his contemporaries who favored aggressive action and bold gestures, Spruance believed in careful analysis, calculated risk, and striking with overwhelming force at the decisive moment. Admiral Nimitz had placed tremendous faith in this relatively untested carrier commander. Spruance had spent his career in cruisers and destroyers, commanding surface combatants rather than aviation forces. His chief of staff, Captain Miles Browning, brought carrier expertise but also a volatile temperament that sometimes created friction. Together, these two men would make decisions in the next hours that would alter the course of the Pacific War. Enterprise and Hornet, collectively known as Task Force 16, steamed in company with 6 cruisers and 9 destroyers, positioned northeast of Midway, exactly where intelligence predicted the Japanese would appear. Admiral Fletcher commanded the overall operation from Yorktown, but the damaged carrier had been delayed in reaching the rendezvous point. When Fletcher's Task Force 17 arrived on the 2nd of June, Spruance's vessels had already been on station for a day. Fletcher, a senior officer, assumed tactical command, but he trusted Spruance to operate independently. This delegation of authority would prove crucial when events began moving at incomprehensible speed. The 4th of June began with both American task forces steaming southwest, maintaining position roughly 200 miles northeast of Midway. At 5:34 that morning, a PBY's contact report confirmed Japanese carriers exactly where codebreakers had predicted. Fletcher ordered Spruance to proceed southwest and attack while Yorktown recovered scout planes. This division of forces gave Spruance complete tactical control of Enterprise and Hornet at the critical moment. Spruance faced an agonizing decision. His air group commanders wanted to launch immediately, but the Japanese carriers lay at the extreme range of American aircraft. Launching now meant his strike force might find the enemy but lack fuel to return home. Waiting meant better odds of recovery but risked losing contact or allowing the Japanese to strike first. Additionally, Spruance had to consider that Nagumo's carriers would be most vulnerable while recovering aircraft from their Midway strike, their flight decks crowded with landing planes and unable to launch fighters. At 7:02 Spruance made his decision. He ordered both Enterprise and Hornet to launch everything they could throw at the enemy, accepting that some aircraft might ditch in the ocean on their return. This commitment of his entire striking power exemplified Spruance's calculated gamble. Strike hard, strike decisively, and accept the risks inherent in such boldness. Within minutes, flight deck crews sprang into coordinated action that resembled a violent ballet. USS Enterprise launched 33 dive bombers, 14 torpedo planes, and 10 Wildcat fighters. USS Hornet contributed 35 dive bombers, 15 torpedo planes, and 10 fighters. In total, 117 aircraft roared off the carrier decks, formed up, and headed southwest toward the Japanese fleet. Leading Enterprise's dive bombers was Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, a 38-year-old aviator with a reputation for steady nerves and exceptional navigation skills. Commander Stanhope ring-led Hornet's air group, though his decisions this day would later generate controversy. The launch consumed over an hour, precious time during which the tactical situation continued evolving. At 7:30, Fletcher launched Yorktown's aircraft, 17 dive bombers, 12 torpedo planes, and 6 fighters. The American strike forces now totaled 151 aircraft hunting for Japanese carriers somewhere in the vast Pacific. However, coordination between the separate strikes would prove nearly impossible. The 3 American carriers had launched independently, and their aircraft groups proceeded toward the target area in separate formations, arriving piecemeal rather than in a concentrated mass. Back aboard Enterprise, Spruance resumed his patient vigil. He had committed his forces. Now he could only wait for reports from pilots who might never return. The Admiral paced the flag bridge, maintaining an outward appearance of calm while internally weighing dozens of variables. Japanese carriers could launch their own strike at any moment. His task force remained vulnerable until scout planes confirmed the enemy's exact composition and position. The uncertainty gnawed at every commander present, but Spruance betrayed no emotion. At 8 o'clock, reports arrived that changed everything. Marine and Navy aircraft from Midway had attacked the Japanese carriers with no success, but their presence confirmed the enemy's position. More importantly, these attacks forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver defensively and launch fighters, further depleting their combat air patrol. However, the Americans paid dearly for these attacks. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, flying obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, pressed their attack with suicidal courage. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 aircraft against the Japanese fleet, boring in at wave-top height through a storm of anti-aircraft fire and 0 fighters. Waldron's squadron approached the Japanese carriers in a desperate attempt to deliver their torpedoes. The Zeros fell upon them like hawks on pigeons, shredding the slow, lumbering Devastators one after another. Waldron's aircraft exploded in flames, killing him instantly. Within minutes, all 15 Devastators had been shot down. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the ocean near the Japanese fleet and witnessing the unfolding battle from the water. The attack achieved nothing except to draw Japanese fighters down to sea level, but that unintended consequence would soon prove decisive. Spruance received reports of these losses with the stoic acceptance of a commander who understood that war consumed young men with appalling efficiency. The question now was whether their sacrifice would mean anything. Whether the dive bombers approaching from high altitude would find their targets and deliver crushing blows before the Japanese carriers could launch their own devastating strike. Everything depended on timing, luck, and the skill of pilots flying aircraft at the absolute limit of their range. Lieutenant Commander Wade, McCluskey circled above empty ocean and faced the sickening realization that his calculated navigation had brought his dive bombers to precisely where the Japanese carriers should have been, except the vast Pacific spread below him contained nothing but white-capped waves. Fuel gauges showed his Douglas Dauntless dive bombers had perhaps 30 minutes of flight time remaining before they would be forced to ditch in the ocean, condemning their crews to death or Japanese captivity. McCluskey had led 33 aircraft from Enterprise on a heading based on the last known position of Nagumo's carriers, but the Japanese admiral had turned north after recovering his Midway strike force. Every minute McCluskey spent searching consumed fuel his pilots would desperately need for the return flight to Enterprise. Navy regulations and tactical doctrine both suggested he should turn back, preserving his aircraft and crews for another day. Yet McCluskey understood that this moment might represent America's only chance to stop the Japanese juggernaut. He made a decision that demonstrated why Spruance had confidence in his air group commander. Instead of turning back immediately, McCluskey would fly an expanding square search pattern, gambling precious fuel for a chance to find the enemy. At 9:35 that morning, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast, leaving a white wake like an arrow pointing toward its destination. The vessel was Arashi, which had been depth-charging the American submarine Nautilus and now hurried to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey's intuition crystallized into certainty. He banked his aircraft to follow that wake, and his gamble paid off with stunning rapidity. Within minutes, the Japanese fleet materialized below him. 3 carriers arranged in a triangular formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being armed and fueled for a strike against the American carriers that Japanese scouts had finally located. McCluskey radioed his squadron commanders, assigning targets. Enterprise's Bombing Squadron 6, under Lieutenant Richard Best, would attack the carrier on the left side of the formation, which was Akagi. Scouting Squadron 6, led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, would strike the carrier on the right Kaga. The carrier Soryu steamed nearby, but McCluskey's force lacked sufficient aircraft to engage all three targets simultaneously, unknown to McCluskey. At almost the same moment, Yorktown's dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie approached from a different angle with Soryu as their designated target. The timing proved exquisite beyond anything doctrine or planning could have achieved. The Japanese carriers wallowed below in their most vulnerable condition imaginable. Nagumo's dithering about whether to rearm his reserve aircraft for a second, Midway strike or maintain them ready for attacking American carriers, had resulted in organized chaos on his flight decks. When scout planes finally reported American carriers at 8 o'clock, Nagumo ordered his aircraft rearmed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Deck crews frantically struck below the fragmentation bombs they had just loaded, creating a dangerous situation with munitions scattered across hangar decks alongside fueling operations. Furthermore, the torpedo attacks by American squadrons, though achieving no hits and suffering appalling casualties, had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top level. When McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attack runs from 17,000 feet, not a single Zero fighter intercepted them at altitude. The Japanese defenders, focused on destroying the low-flying torpedo planes, never saw death descending from above until the Dauntlesses were already in their near-vertical dives. At precisely 10:22 on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, Lieutenant Richard Best pushed over into his attack dive on Akagi. His section followed him down through scattered anti-aircraft. Fire that intensified as Japanese gunners belatedly recognized the new threat. Best centered Akagi's flight deck in his bomb sight, making minute adjustments as his Dauntless accelerated toward terminal velocity. At 1,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out of the dive so hard that his vision grayed from G-forces. Best's bomb struck Akagi's flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck before exploding among the aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The blast ignited aviation gasoline and detonated torpedoes, creating a massive fireball that ripped through the carrier's interior spaces. Within seconds, Akagi transformed from a proud warship into a blazing coffin for her crew. 2 more bombs struck the doomed carrier, ensuring her destruction. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge watching his flagship die around him, finally transferring his flag to a cruiser as Akagi's crew fought hopeless fires. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Gallagher's Scouting Squadron 6 struck Kaga with devastating precision. 4 bombs hit the larger carrier in quick succession, turning her flight deck into an inferno. The first bomb struck near the bridge, killing most of Kaga's senior officers instantly. Subsequent bombs penetrated the flight deck to explode among fueled aircraft in the hangar, creating secondary explosions that tore the ship apart from within. Kaga's 850-foot hull became a floating torch as flames consumed aircraft, fuel, and men with impartial fury. Miles away, Yorktown's dive bombers descended on Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie had lost his own bomb due to an electrical malfunction, but his squadron pressed their attacks with determination matching their Enterprise counterparts. 3 bombs struck Soryu in rapid succession, one detonating in the hangar deck among 18 fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion and subsequent fire proved instantly catastrophic. Within 20 minutes of being hit, Soryu's captain ordered abandon ship as flames made further firefighting impossible. In 5 minutes of incredibly violent action, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor ceased to exist as fighting units. The Kido Butai, which had dominated every engagement since the 7th of December 1941, had been effectively destroyed before most of its pilots even understood they were under attack. American dive bomber pilots pulled out of their runs and formed up for the return flight to their carriers, witnessing below them the funeral pyres of Japanese naval aviation. Captain Tomio Kaku commanded the aircraft carrier Hiryu, the sole survivor of Nagumo's once mighty Kido Butai, and he understood that the burden of salvaging victory from catastrophe now rested entirely on his ship's flight deck. Hiryu had been steaming separately from her sister carriers when the American dive bomber struck, positioned several miles north of the main formation. This fortuitous separation meant that when McCluskey's and Leslie's aircraft transformed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu into burning wrecks, Hiryu remained untouched and capable of launching her own devastating counterstrike. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu, possessed a reputation as one of Japan's most aggressive and capable naval officers, like the stunned Nagumo, who wandered the bridge of a cruiser in shock at his catastrophic losses. Yamaguchi immediately grasped that speed and audacity represented his only hope. At 10:40 that morning, barely 18 minutes after the American dive bombers departed, Hiryu launched 18 VAL dive bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led this strike force northeast toward the American carriers that scout planes had located approximately 100 miles distant. The Japanese pilots flew with grim determination, knowing they represented their fleet's last offensive capability. Behind them, 3 carriers burned furiously, their crews desperately fighting fires or abandoning ship as explosions tore through internal compartments. Takagi Nagumo's flagship and symbol of Japanese carrier aviation wallowed with her bow section already settling as flames consumed her after section. Kaga listed heavily to starboard, her hull fractured by internal explosions. Soryu blazed from stem to stern, her crew leaping into the sea to escape temperatures that melted steel. Hundreds of Japanese sailors died in those flames, trapped below decks or overcome by smoke. At 11:50, Kobayashi's strike force sighted Task Force 17. Admiral Fletcher's Yorktown steamed in company with 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers, having recovered the last of her aircraft. Radar operators aboard Yorktown detected the incoming Japanese strike at 46 miles range, providing precious minutes to prepare. Fletcher ordered his combat air patrol reinforced, and within minutes 12 additional Wildcat fighters climbed to intercept the attackers. Anti-aircraft gun crews aboard every vessel in the task force manned their stations, training weapons skyward. The Wildcats tore into Kobayashi's formation with aggressive attacks that disrupted the carefully coordinated strike. Commander John Thatch, leading Yorktown's fighter combat air patrol, Kant employed a defensive weaving tactic he had developed that allowed pairs of Wildcats to protect each other against the more maneuverable Zeros. The Thatch weave proved devastatingly effective, and American fighters shot down 10 of the 18 attacking dive bombers before they reached their pushover points. However, the remaining 8 VALs pressed through the defensive screen with the fatalistic courage that characterized Japanese naval aviation. At noon, Kobayashi himself centered Yorktown in his bomb sight and released his bomb in a near-vertical dive. The missile struck the carrier's flight deck, penetrating 3 decks before exploding in a ventilation trunk. The blast snuffed out fires in 5 of Yorktown's 6 boilers, reducing her speed from 30 knots to 0 within minutes. 2 more bombs hit in rapid succession, one exploding in the funnel uptake and another in the forward elevator well. The carrier staggered under these blows, listing slightly and wreathed in smoke. Damage control parties aboard Yorktown responded with impressive skill. The ship's chief engineer, Commander Jack Delaney, rallied his men to restart boilers and restore power. Within an hour, Yorktown regained propulsion and worked up to 19 knots, though still badly damaged. Crews cleared wreckage, fought fires, and tended wounded shipmates while maintaining air operations. Fletcher reluctantly transferred his flag to the heavy cruiser Astoria, as Yorktown's communication systems had suffered extensive damage. This transfer of command temporarily disrupted coordination between American task forces at a critical moment. Admiral Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu received reports that his strike had hit and possibly sunk an American carrier. Encouraged, he immediately prepared a second strike, this time consisting of 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero escorts. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the morning strike on Midway and whose aircraft had been damaged by anti-aircraft fire, volunteered to lead this mission, despite knowing his fuel tank had been punctured. Tominaga understood he would not survive the return flight, yet he insisted on participating in what might be Japan's last opportunity to inflict meaningful damage on the American fleet. At 12:45, Tominaga's strike force departed Hiryu's deck and proceeded northeast. Yamaguchi knew that somewhere out there, additional American carriers likely waited. His scouts had reported only 1 flat top initially, yet the coordinated American attacks suggested multiple carriers operated in the area. If his second strike succeeded in finishing Yorktown, Hiryu might withdraw to fight another day. If American dive bombers found him first, Japan's carrier force would be completely annihilated. It was a race against time, with each side desperately searching for the other while maneuvering to strike first. Back aboard Enterprise, Spruance monitored reports from returning pilots and struggled to develop a clear picture of the battle's status.
Yes.
His dive bombers had clearly hit multiple Japanese carriers, but exactly how many remained operational? Where was the fourth Japanese carrier that intelligence had predicted? Fuel concerns meant his aircraft needed recovery before launching another strike. The admiral weighed risks and possibilities, knowing that hesitation could surrender the initiative, but hasty action might sacrifice his forces needlessly. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led his 10K torpedo bombers toward Yorktown with the calm acceptance of a warrior who had made peace with death. The punctured fuel tank in his aircraft meant he could reach the target but never return to Hiryu. Yet this reality merely reinforced his determination to make his sacrifice meaningful. Behind him flew pilots who shared his code of Bushido, willing to die for emperor and homeland if their deaths served a greater purpose. As they approached Task Force 17 at 2:30 that afternoon, they could see a carrier steaming steadily, despite obvious bomb damage from the earlier strike. The Americans knew they were coming. Radar had detected Tominaga's formation at 40 miles, and Admiral Fletcher had vectored every available fighter to intercept. 12 Wildcats climbed to meet the attackers, engaging the Zero escorts in a swirling dogfight while attempting to reach the vulnerable torpedo bombers. The Kates flew at wave-top height, their torpedoes slung beneath their fuselages, approaching from multiple angles to split Yorktown's defensive fire and increase the probability that some would reach launch position. Commander Oscar Pedersen maneuvered Yorktown radically, attempting to present the smallest possible target, while his anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with exploding shells. The carrier's 5-inch guns fired at maximum rate, creating black puffs of flak that should have destroyed low-flying aircraft. Smaller 40mm and 20mm guns added streams of tracers that crisscrossed above the wave-tops. Despite this withering fire, the Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with samurai dedication. Boring through the barrage at 300 feet altitude, Tominaga's aircraft took multiple hits, trailing smoke and flame. But he maintained formation and released his torpedo at optimal range before his Kate plunged into the Pacific in a cascade of spray and burning aviation fuel. His sacrifice, and that of his squadron mates, achieved its purpose. 5 torpedoes tracked through the water toward Yorktown's vulnerable hull, their wakes clearly visible to sailors watching helplessly from the carrier's deck. Pedersen turned Yorktown hard to port, attempting to comb the torpedo wakes, but simple physics betrayed him. The carrier's length and momentum made rapid course changes impossible. Torpedoes approached from both sides of his vessel simultaneously. 2:44, 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side almost simultaneously, the explosions tearing massive holes in her hull below the waterline. The carrier staggered like a gut-shot animal, her frame shuddering from the impacts. Water flooded into Yorktown's lower compartments with frightening speed. The ship developed a severe list to port that increased rapidly as tons of seawater poured through the torpedo wounds. All power failed as the flooding shorted electrical systems and extinguished boiler fires. In darkness below decks, damage control parties struggled to contain flooding and shore up bulkheads, knowing their ship might capsize at any moment. The list reached 26 degrees, and Captain Elliot Buckmaster reluctantly ordered abandoned ship, unwilling to trap his crew inside a rolling hole. Destroyers closed alongside Yorktown to pluck survivors from the water and collect men sliding down ropes from the carrier's high side. Sailors abandoned their ship with discipline, many pausing to inflate life rafts or help wounded shipmates despite the vessel's increasing list. Within 30 minutes, nearly 3,000 men had evacuated, though the carrier remained obstinately afloat. Buckmaster transferred to a destroyer and watched his command wallow beam on to the swells, listing heavily but not sinking. The carrier that had been patched in 72 hours at Pearl Harbor and fought courageously at both Coral Sea and Midway seemed determined to survive even this mortal blow. While Yorktown's crew struggled for survival, Spruance had been locating the source of the Japanese strikes. Scout planes finally reported Hiru's position approximately 110 miles northwest of Task Force 16. Without waiting for perfect information, Spruance ordered Enterprise to launch every available dive bomber. At 3:30, 24 Dauntlesses roared off Enterprise's deck, followed shortly by 16 more from Hornet that had rearmed after the morning strikes. Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, who had helped sink Kaga that morning, would lead Enterprise's aircraft against Hiryu. The dive bombers navigated toward Hiryu's last reported position, racing to strike before darkness made carrier operations impossible. Time pressure intensified as the afternoon wore on, fuel concerns again, limiting operational flexibility. If they failed to find Hiryu quickly, the surviving Japanese carrier would escape to fight another day, and 3 more American carriers might face attack tomorrow. Everything depended on precise navigation and aggressive action in the narrowing window before sunset. At 5 o'clock, Gallagher's pilots spotted Hiryu steaming at high speed, accompanied by battleships Haruna and Kirishima, plus screening cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese carrier had recovered Tomonaga's surviving aircraft and appeared ready to launch another strike. On Hiryu's flag bridge, Admiral Yamaguchi understood his desperate situation. American dive bombers had already destroyed 3 carriers that morning, and now they had found his ship. He ordered maximum anti-aircraft fire and radical evasive maneuvers, but these proved futile against determined dive bomber attacks from high altitude. At 5:03, the first bomb struck Hiryu's flight deck. For direct hits and several near misses transformed the carrier into a blazing wreck within minutes. Fires spread with terrifying speed, igniting ammunition and fuel and repeating secondary explosions that tore through the ship's structure. By nightfall, Hiryu's crew fought hopeless fires in a vessel that had clearly suffered mortal damage. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard his flagship, dying with the ship in accordance with samurai tradition when Hiryu finally sank the following morning. Admiral Spruance faced perhaps the most difficult decision of his career as darkness fell over the Pacific on the 4th of June. 3. Japanese carriers burned or had already sunk, but intelligence suggested enemy battleships and heavy cruisers remained in the vicinity, possibly seeking a night surface engagement where their superior firepower and training would prove decisive. Commander Miles Browning, Spruance's volatile chief of staff, urged an aggressive pursuit to finish off crippled Japanese vessels. Other staff officers counseled caution, arguing that blundering into enemy battleships in darkness would court disaster. Spruance's decision reflected the calculating intelligence that defined his command style. Rather than chase westward into unknown waters where Yamamoto's powerful battleships might lie in wait, he turned east, away from the enemy. This counterintuitive move preserved his carriers for the following day while denying Japanese surface forces the night engagement they desired. Critics would later question whether more aggressive action might have achieved greater results, but Spruance understood that his primary mission was protecting the Hawaiian Islands, not pursuing vengeance at excessive risk. Aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto struggled to comprehend the catastrophic defeat his intricate plan had produced. Reports of 4 carriers destroyed or burning seemed impossible to credit. The operation designed to eliminate American carrier power had instead annihilated Japan's own carrier fleet. Yamamoto briefly considered pressing forward with his battleships to bombard Midway and force a surface engagement. But without air cover, such a move would expose his remaining vessels to land-based aircraft from both Midway and Hawaii. At 2:30 on the morning of the 5th of June, Yamamoto issued the order to withdraw. His diversionary force attacking the Aleutians had successfully occupied Attu and Kiska, tiny islands in the fog-shrouded Aleutian chain. But this minor territorial gain could not offset the catastrophic carrier losses at Midway. The admiral who had warned Japan's leaders he could run wild for 6 months had now exhausted both his time and his fleet. The 6-month period from Pearl Harbor to Midway had ended not in decisive victory, but in devastating defeat. Japanese destroyers approached the burning hulks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu during the night, rescuing survivors where possible, but facing the grim task of scuttling vessels that could not be saved. Kagi Nagumo's proud flagship took 4 torpedoes from Japanese destroyers before finally slipping beneath the waves at 5 o'clock on the morning of the 5th. Kaga had already sunk after internal explosions tore her hull apart. Soryu went down fighting, her crew maintaining discipline even as their ship settled into the depths. Hiryu, damaged the previous evening, remained afloat but burning uncontrollably. As dawn broke on the 5th of June, American search planes fanned out to locate remaining Japanese vessels. They discovered Hiryu still afloat, but clearly doomed, along with various cruisers and destroyers withdrawing westward at high speed. Spruance authorized attacks on these targets, hoping to increase Japanese losses. Dive bombers from Enterprise damaged the heavy cruiser Mikuma so severely that she sank later that day, her hull torn apart by bombs and internal explosions. The heavy cruiser Mogami suffered extensive damage, but managed to withdraw, her bow shattered, and hundreds of her crew dead or wounded. Yorktown remained the battle's wild card. The abandoned carrier continued floating through the night of the 4th, her list stabilizing as flooding slowed. Captain Buckmaster, observing from a destroyer, decided his ship might be salvageable if damage control parties could return aboard and restart pumps. At dawn on the 5th, a volunteer crew returned to Yorktown and began the dangerous work of salvaging a damaged ship in hostile waters. They managed to reduce the list and restart some pumps, raising hopes the carrier might reach Pearl Harbor for repairs. The submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been shadowing the American task forces since the 4th. Japanese headquarters ordered Tanabe to locate and finish off any damaged American carriers. On the 6th of June, he found Yorktown under tow by the minesweeper Vireo, escorted by 5 destroyers. Tanabe pressed his attack with extraordinary skill, evading the screen and closing to within 500 yards of Yorktown before firing for torpedoes. 3 struck home, 2 hitting Yorktown and 1 hitting the destroyer Haman alongside, breaking the destroyer's back and killing 81 men. The torpedo hits sealed Yorktown's fate. The carrier, which had survived attacks at Coral Sea and 2 separate strikes at Midway, finally succumbed to accumulated damage. She rolled over and sank at dawn on the 7th of June, taking with her the hopes of salvage crews who had fought so hard to save her. More than 200 officers and crew had died aboard Yorktown during the battle and subsequent salvage efforts. The carrier that Nimitz's miracle workers had patched in 72 hours had bought precious time and contributed materially to the American victory before meeting her end in the waters off Midway. By the 7th of June, both fleets had withdrawn, leaving Midway in American hands and the Central Pacific littered with wreckage. The cost in lives proved sobering. Japan lost approximately 3,000 men, including hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. America suffered 307 killed, including the entire complement of Torpedo Squadron 8 and most of Yorktown's crew who went down with their ship. These numbers, clinical in their precision, represented thousands of individual tragedies: wives widowed, children left fatherless, parents mourning sons who would never return home. Spruance's carriers steamed back toward Pearl Harbor. Their hangar decks spotted with damaged aircraft, and their crews exhausted but victorious. The admiral who had gambled his entire force on a single decisive strike had achieved a victory whose strategic consequences would echo through the remainder of the war. As Enterprise and Hornet crossed the Pacific toward Hawaii, their escorts maintained vigilant anti-submarine watches, aware that Japanese submarines continued prowling the waters, seeking targets. Admiral Nimitz stood at the dock in Pearl Harbor on the 13th of June and watched Enterprise and Hornet steam into the harbor that Japanese aircraft had devastated 6 months earlier. The carriers bore scars from intensive operations, their hulls streaked with rust and their crews showing the exhaustion of sustained combat operations. Yet these vessels and their men had accomplished what many military analysts had considered impossible. They had defeated a numerically superior enemy fleet and shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. The victory's strategic implications began manifesting immediately. Japan's Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers that would require years to replace, along with irreplaceable veteran aircrew whose training and experience could not be duplicated, according to analysis that would later appear in studies published by the Naval War College. Japan's naval aviation never recovered from these losses. The Kido Butai had represented not merely ships, but a concentration of expertise, training, and tactical proficiency accumulated over years of intensive preparation. Replacing the carriers proved difficult enough. Replacing the men proved impossible. Perhaps more crucially, the Battle of Midway ended Japan's strategic offensive in the Pacific. The combined fleet, which had ranged across the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon with impunity, would henceforth fight defensively. Plans to invade Fiji and Samoa, which would have cut supply lines between America and Australia, were cancelled. The assault on Port Moresby in New Guinea, which could have threatened Australia itself, stalled. Japan's defensive perimeter, stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, would now be contested at every point as American industrial might began producing carriers, aircraft, and pilots at rates Japan could never match. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, immediately recognized Midway's significance for his planned campaigns. With Japanese naval aviation crippled, operations in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea became feasible. Less than 2 months after Midway, American Marines would land on Guadalcanal, beginning a brutal 6-month campaign that further degraded Japan's military capability. The Solomons campaign consumed Japanese aircraft and pilots at unsustainable rates, accelerating the decline that began at Midway. The psychological impact reverberated through both military establishments and civilian populations. Americans, reeling from 6 months of unbroken defeats, finally had a decisive victory to celebrate. The nation's newspapers headlined the triumph, though censorship prevented full disclosure of operational details. "Navy smashes Japanese fleet," proclaimed the New York Times, while the Chicago Tribune's coverage inadvertently revealed that American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese communications, creating a security crisis, but also demonstrating to the public that American intelligence capabilities matched or exceeded their adversaries. Japanese leaders faced the opposite problem, concealing the extent of defeat from their own population. The government announced that one carrier had been lost while American losses exceeded Japanese casualties. Returning survivors were quarantined on remote bases to prevent accurate information from reaching the public. Families of dead sailors received notifications that their loved ones had died in unspecified naval actions. Preserving operational security while denying relatives the truth about their losses, this culture of denial, extending to Japan's highest military commands, would persist throughout the war. Emperor Hirohito received accurate reports of the disaster, and the defeat caused significant discussions within Japan's Supreme Command about future strategic direction. Some officers, including Admiral Yamamoto himself, privately acknowledged that Japan could no longer win the war in any conventional sense. However, institutional momentum, cultural factors preventing acknowledgement of failure, and fear of losing face all combined to ensure that Japan would fight on despite the strategic impossibility of victory. The war would continue for 3 more years, consuming millions of lives in battles that Midway had rendered strategically meaningless. Intelligence analysts at Station Hypo, whose code-breaking had made the American victory possible, received little public recognition during the war. Commander Rochefort and his team continued their thankless work in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, decrypting Japanese communications that informed subsequent operations. However, bureaucratic rivalries in Washington resulted in Rochefort being reassigned from Station Hypo, a decision that historians would later characterize as one of the Navy's greatest injustices. The man whose intelligence work had enabled Midway never received appropriate recognition during his lifetime. The battle also revealed technological and tactical lessons both sides needed to address. American torpedoes, particularly the Mark 13 aerial torpedo and the Mark 14 submarine torpedo, suffered from catastrophic reliability problems. Multiple torpedo attacks at Midway produced no hits, with weapons running too deep, failing to explode, or circling back toward the launching vessel. These problems would persist embarrassingly far into the war, hampering submarine operations and air attacks until finally corrected in late 1943. Japanese doctrine emphasized offensive action and aggressive engagement, but Midway demonstrated the vulnerability of carriers to air attack and the difficulty of protecting them without adequate early warning systems and fighter direction. Japan would attempt to address these deficiencies by developing better radar and fighter control systems, but resource constraints and technological limitations meant they never achieved parity with American capabilities. The fundamental problem remained Japan's inability to replace losses at anything approaching American production rates. American shipyards were already laying down new Essex-class carriers that would enter service in 1943, each displacing over 30,000 tons and capable of operating 90 aircraft. Behind them came the Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls and providing additional flight decks for the expanding carrier fleet. By the end of 1944, America would operate over 20 fleet carriers in the Pacific, a numerical superiority that would prove absolutely decisive in subsequent campaigns. The full significance of the Battle of Midway crystallized slowly as subsequent events demonstrated how completely the strategic balance had shifted. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding Midway's garrison, watched construction crews repair the atoll's installations and reflected on his men's role in the victory. The garrison had absorbed a ferocious assault, lost dozens of aircraft, and suffered significant casualties. Yet they had survived, and Midway remained in American hands, exactly as intelligence had predicted it would if the garrison could hold out long enough for the carriers to arrive. The pilots who flew from Midway that 4th of June paid a terrible price for contesting Japanese supremacy. Of the 26 Marine fighters that intercepted the first Japanese strike, only 15 survived. Captain John Carey, who led those obsolete Buffaloes against superior Zeros, survived but lost most of his squadron. The torpedo bombers and level bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers from Midway achieved no hits while suffering catastrophic losses. Yet these unsuccessful attacks disrupted Japanese operations, forcing Nagumo to maneuver defensively and maintaining pressure that prevented optimal Japanese tactical coordination. Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice exemplified the courage and tragedy inherent in the battle. 15 aircraft launched from Hornet with Lieutenant Commander John Waldron leading them toward the Japanese carriers. Waldron, convinced that prevailing tactical doctrine was flawed, had briefed his pilots that they would fly directly to the target rather than following the bombers. His judgment proved correct, as his squadron found the Japanese carriers, while other Hornet squadrons searched fruitlessly. However, without fighter escort or dive bomber support, Waldron's slow torpedo planes faced impossible odds. Ensign George Gay, the squadron's sole survivor, watched from the ocean as his squadron mates died around him. He witnessed Waldron's aircraft explode in flames, saw subsequent devastators disintegrate under Zero attacks, and floated among the debris of American defeat. Yet from his position near the Japanese fleet, Gay also witnessed the dive bomber attacks that transformed the battle. He watched Akagi take a bomb amidships and saw the fire spread uncontrollably through the carrier. He observed Japanese sailors abandoning ship and destroyers closing to rescue survivors. His testimony, collected after his rescue, provided crucial battle damage assessment that confirmed Japanese losses. The dive bomber pilots who achieved the decisive blows faced their own challenges. Many aircraft returned to their carriers with fuel tanks nearly empty, barely making arrested landings before their engines quit. Several crews ditched near the task force and were recovered by screening destroyers. The physical and mental strain of the mission, flown at extreme range against determined opposition, left pilots exhausted. Yet they had accomplished their mission with extraordinary effectiveness, sinking 3 carriers in 5 minutes through precise attack execution. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey received the Navy Cross for his leadership of Enterprise's air group, but he understood the victory had required contributions from hundreds of individuals. The ordnancemen who loaded bombs and maintained aircraft, the mechanics who kept engines running, the deck crews who spotted aircraft for launch under combat conditions, the radar operators who detected incoming strikes, the radio operators who maintained communications, all played essential roles in the complex ballet of carrier operations.